By way of introduction, I'm going to read you a short narrative. I once spent an entire 2-week package holiday in Mallorca sewing sequins by hand onto fabric in order to finish a piece of artwork for a solo show I was having. A deadline is a deadline. I'd convinced myself it'd be fine. I could sit by the swimming pool with a G&T, soak up the sun while getting on with the job at hand. To my surprise, I was the talk of the hotel with the other holiday makers. Have you seen that bloke by the pool? He's been sewing sequins onto that bit of fabric for days. Various proposals were made as to what I was up to, until a lady from a group of older women plucked up the courage to ask me directly. We made polite conversation for a while, and after telling her I was an artist and that I was making a piece of work for an exhibition, she then exclaimed that she loved my beautiful map of Mallorca, my beautiful sequined map of Mallorca. She didn't look as impressed when I said, "No, it's not a map of Mallorca, it's a massive pile of vomit." For the rest of the holiday, I was avoided at all costs, and on meeting new guests, I would often find them saying, "Oh, so you're the artist." I was obviously some sort of degenerate, a heathen, someone not to be trusted. The revelation of my activity produced only one reaction in my fellow holidaymakers: horror. I could sense them all asking the same question. Why on earth would anybody want to replicate something that's so disgusting? Well, that's a point. Maybe I should begin there. I suppose it all started with my mum. Growing up, the one thing I remember her saying over and over again was, "Craig, remember, cleanliness is next to godliness." And this is from someone who isn't religious. In Mary Douglas's book on Purity and Danger, she suggests that dirt is essentially disorder. Eliminating it is not a negative movement, but a positive effort to organise the environment. If uncleanness is matter out of place, we must approach it through order. Uncleanness or dirt is that which must not be included if pattern is to be maintained. The emphasis on everything being clean and tidy, that nothing should be out of place, was ingrained in me, to the point that I was the only boy at high school who somehow managed to play rugby each week without getting dirty. God forbid my all-white PE kit getting soiled. What would my mother think? Dirt, it's dangerous, isn't it? Dirt like snot and piss and shit and spunk and blood and vomit are all bad and disgusting and ugly, whereas cleanness and neatness and order are all good and proper and beautiful. Really, I wonder, can something like puke be beautiful? Can something like puke be beautiful and grotesque, seductive and repellent? Can it be both? In his article on ugliness, Dave Beach cites Mark Cousins' analysis of ugliness, saying that ugliness has its own integral characteristics. It's a specific kind of excess. It's not negative of beauty or the absence of beauty, but the experience of something being in the wrong place or of not having a right place to be. Cousins argues that ugliness is best understood in terms of the stain, which is linked to sin and contamination. The ugly object should not be there, he says, for the very specific reason that it is the obstacle which stands in the way of desire. Ugliness is trauma. The trauma for the subject is occasioned by the sudden appearance of stuff, the stuff which threatens to overwhelm and engulf the subject and to contaminate the subject with its own lack of meaning. So what if the other lads thought I was a pufter, a Nancy boy, a queer? I could cope with the insults just as long as I didn't get any shit on me. So, kind of, as you can see, I spent an inordinate amount of time trying to replicate and represent a pile of puke. And this started, the whole ideas, I suppose, were kind of thinking about notions of kind of, I suppose, notions of masculinity and ideas of kind of otherness and queerness and this idea that I often, as a kind of as a youngster, would be accused of being a queer, or my sexuality was often brought into question, and then having to kind of come to terms with my heterosexuality, but maybe someone who's kind of camp or who likes shopping and doesn't want to play football. It became this kind of whole set of ideas that I started to think about, this idea of bravado, and so this piece was a piece I made. Yes, it's called Spunk, and so it's a 6-foot ejaculate. And I was interested in the idea of trying to represent something that, in terms of those taboos that I talk about in relation to growing up, kind of could I make something that was kind of disgusting but make it beautiful? Try to kind of almost clean it up, make it, sanitize it, make it desirable. Because it is desirable, but it's also disgusting. So, and I suppose I was interested in artists like Sue Williams, who's an American artist who often represents the kind of bodily, the grotesque, the kind of visceral, the internal. So there's this reference to things like intestines and spleens and arteries and kind of sphincters, and so. But there's something about the kind of the sense that you can kind of also look at this as a kind of form of ornamentation and decoration. So the work, I suppose, I've been making is kind of an examination of my interest in kind of making something that can be both kind of repugnant or horrific or grotesque, but also seductive and beguiling and sensual and sexy. So this is a piece called Leek and Chav Corner. So again, I was thinking about the idea of a kind of a masculine stereotype or a masculine identity. So the notion of your kind of your chav, your being from Liverpool. I was the odd one out. So it's this idea of why did I find it offensive to piss up on a corner? What was it that stopped me from doing that? So what would it be like if I tried to turn that on itself and try and remake it and represent it? I did a residency in a place called Hal Palamo, the art apartment in Geneva. And again, this idea of disgust, I witnessed the curator constantly telling me that he was really upset because his baby was teething and he couldn't sleep, and he wasn't able to get a proper night's sleep. So I gave him the option. I thought it would be useful. I thought it was a useful strategy for him. So in relation to this idea of kind of masculinity or the idea of seduction, I'm really interested in artists like Robert Mapplethorpe, and as particularly this idea of man in a polyester suit. I think this image, the first time I saw it, I couldn't get over how seduced by it I was. I was really arrested by this image. And it was because I was so disgusted by the polyester and so in love with this man's willy. There's something about the way in which Mapplethorpe starts to make you look at this kind of member, and you start to think about it in terms of its surface. It's like velvet. It's kind of so alluring and seductive, and it's something to do with this kind of contrast between that and this nasty polyester. And I'm really interested in these kind of contradictions and juxtapositions, and a kind of space in between where you're constantly I suppose toing and froing between two different positions. And also it's all this idea of, as a heterosexual, how can I enjoy that image? How can I find it fascinating? How can I find it alluring and seductive? Because I'm not meant to. It's not something I'm meant to be. I shouldn't be engaging in that. And so this kind of idea of kind of propriety or what's proper, or I think it's something really interesting about how he opens that up. And obviously with his series of self-portraits, but also in terms of this kind of relationship to beauty and also taboo. I just want to read you a section from Dave Hickey's in The Invisible Dragon. So images like Robert Mapplethorpe's ex-portfolio. Tilt the altars at which we worship by making them all seem probable. In doing so, they collapse and conflate the hierarchies of our response to sex, art and religion, and in the process generate considerable anxiety. So we may, according to our want or desire, read the ex-portfolio in the language of religion or sexuality, or of formalist aesthetics, but we must do so knowing the artist himself positioned his images exactly at their intersection. The categories are our own cultures, the images themselves. Under the pressure of our categories don't seem to be anything in particular, they just seem to be too much. We are left asking, why do I submit to this gritty Baroque image of a man's arm disappearing into another man's anus, and choose to speculate upon it? And why must Robert have submitted to the actual intimate, aromatic spectacle and chosen to portray it? And finally, why did the supplicant kneel and submit to having a lubricated fist shoved up his arse and choose to have himself so portrayed? And the answer, of course, in every case is pleasure and control, but deferred, always deferred, shunted upward through concentric rituals of trust and apprehension, glimmering through sexual, aesthetic and spiritual manifestations, resonating outward from the heat of the image through every decision to expand the context of its socialization, suspending time at every point, postponing consummation, and then suddenly, at the apogee of its suspense, swooping back down, circling rapidly inward upon an image now flickering in wintry glamour at the intersection of moral suffering and spiritual ecstasy, where the rule of law meets the grace of trust. It is a nothing image, really, not even an idea, but so palpably corporal on the one hand and so technically extravagant on the other, that it seems on the verge of exploding from its own internal contradictions, or just disappearing when we look away. So, again, in terms of this idea of disgust, I also started to think about kind of thinking about images of or representations of violence and destruction, and as a kind of form of disgust, and starting to think about how would I, in representing it, can I emphasise and heighten a kind of sense of allure and sensuality and seduction. So the idea of our fascination and seduction with such images. So there's a kind of compulsion that we have in relation to the kind of these kinds of images. We are compelled to look, but we shouldn't, but we should, but we can't help it. So I'm really interested in those ideas. So back to Puke. I in making this, I was thinking about, I suppose, the idea. There's the architect Adolf Loos whose ornament is crime. There's a really this really interesting idea that the ideas of the ornamental are degenerative, or a degenerate activity. They are bad, and I'm really interested in for me, what's the difference between a kind of a beautiful pile of vomit and Pat Butcher's earrings, and this idea of something being, so the idea of the grotesque or disgusting can be both. The beauty can be disgusting. So the idea of this kind of ornamental decorativeness being also a form of disgust. It's beautiful and ugly at the same time. It's attractive and repellent at the same time. And thinking about artists like Jessica Craig Martin and her recording and documenting of society ladies and kind of society events, and this kind of play between this real sense of extravagance and decadence and kind of wealth also kind of being disgusting, and I'm really interested in kind of this kind of in-between space. So Liberace, I'm really interested and fascinated by the kind of the idea of Liberace and this notion of extravagance and decadence. And again, I've just got another little section from another Dave Hickey text called A Rhinestone as Big as the Ritz. Friends of mine who visit watch this light show. This is in view of talking about the landscape within Las Vegas. Friends of mine who visit watch this light show with different eyes. They prefer the page of the landscape to the text of the neon. They seem to think it's more authentic. I, on the other hand, suspect that authenticity is altogether elsewhere, that they are responding to nature's ability to mimic the sincerity of a painting, that the question of the sunset and the strip is more a matter of one's taste and duplicity. One either prefers the honest fakery of the neon or the fake honesty of the sunset, the undisguised artifice of culture or the cultural construction of authenticity, the genuine rhinestone, finally, or the imitation pearl. As its emblem, I cite my favourite object in his collection, as in, this is Liberace's, its keystone in fact, the secret heart and sacred arc of Las Vegas itself, the world's largest rhinestone, 100,000 carats, revolving in a circular vitrine, dazzling us all with its plangent banality. It weighs 50.6 pounds and is fabricated of pure lead glass. It was manufactured by Swarovski Gem Company, the rhinestone people of Vienna, and presented to Liberace as a token of appreciation for his patronage for the virtual fields of less substantial rhinestones he had acquired from them over the years to endow his costumes, his cars, his furniture, his pianos with their Eras spiritual dazzle. In my view, this was money well spent, but within the confines of the Liberace Museum, dazzle they certainly do. Within these three large showrooms spaced around a shopping centre on East Tropicana Boulevard, dazzle rules. Everything fake looks bona fide. Everything that Liberace created or caused to be created as a function of his shows or his showmanship. His costumes, his cars, his jewellery, his candelabra, his pianos, shines with a crisp pop authority. Everything created as a consequence of his endeavour, like the mega rhinestone, exudes a high-dollar, egalitarian permission. Well, everything he purchased out of his rising slum-kid appetite for old-world charm and legitimacy, everything real in other worlds, looks unabashedly phony. So I suppose what I started to think about was this idea of trying to consider I suppose in relation to the idea of something being completely exaggerated or kind of saturated, and could I emphasise? I suppose there's something in really kind of this idea of trying to subvert something which is disgusting or horrific or grotesque through a process of using something which is ornamental or decorative, and I'm really interested. This piece is called Get Rid. So again, there's this kind of the kind of use of the sequins as a form of dazzle, so that you get this idea of the stain, which is kind of made beguiling. These are just some other examples of my practice. I'm kind of interested in relation to my interest in Disgust in relation to camp and the idea of theatricality and notions of spectacle. So I just wanted to there's just a quote by Susan Sontag in her notes on camp. Camp is a certain mode of aestheticism. It is one way of seeing the world as an aesthetic phenomenon. That way, the way of camp, is not in terms of beauty, but in terms of the degree of artifice or stylisation. To perceive camp in objects and persons is to understand being as playing a role. It is the farthest extension, in sensibility, of the metaphor of life as theatre. The hallmark of camp is the spirit of extravagance. Camp is a woman walking around in a dress made of 3 million feathers. So again, I'm kind of interested in this idea of too muchness, of over-the-topness. So the idea that almost the way that I'm making the work kind of is akin to also what's being represented, and there's this kind of play off or juxtaposition. So yeah, this is called Folly and Violence. I was interested in, I just wanted to include some other references. So this was a reference to Dana Schutz, who is an American painter, and her series called Face Eaters. And again, I'm really interested in the idea that these images of women devouring themselves, and there's something, again, completely kind of grotesque in that, but also really kind of captivating, and you're really held by these images. So the idea of what does it mean to devour yourself, to almost that you're devouring yourself in order to disappear. And I suppose I'm interested in thinking about some of the other works as a form of abstraction. So the idea that you're looking at this thing which is a car crash, for example. So you're engaging it in this moment which is kind of horrific, but is also flaccid and empty, and it's kind of the kind of horror or the disgust is kind of vacated, and you're left with a vessel, but you're aware of its image, of its representation. So you're kind of constantly toing and froing between this thing which is kind of anodyne, but also kind of visceral, and I'm kind of interested in those kinds of ideas. Am I running out of time? Okay. 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 So I suppose part of my interest in thinking about the kind of I suppose both the disgust and the decorative is that for me they're both dangerous. They're both kind of difficult to pin down, and I suppose I'm interested in how they might be employed to kind of ask questions of the way in which we think through kind of representation, and kind of so the idea of kind of questioning our ideas of a kind of mediated or kind of image, and I suppose it's this kind of sense of almost kind of dismissing something, but also kind of being seduced by it as well. So this is a piece called What a Load of Shit, and I suppose what I was interested in is this again, these kinds of images of disaster or aftermath, but also these things that also I spent a long time thinking about, into what I started with, looking at, going around photographing bird shit. And so these are my images of bird, these are kind of my embroideries of bird shit. And people would just look at me so weirdly, because I would be like on the ground, as close to some shit as I could physically get my camera to it. And I didn't get, people thought I was bonkers. But anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Again, we've got time for 2 questions. I have one.
Go on.
No one else. I was wondering to what extent your use of materials and the question of disgust here was also had some relationship to class and to people being in the right place and people sort of using the right materials. So sort of the idea of the kind of fakery or that you might associate with Liberace. To what extent there's those that are allowed to be ostentatious, and for those for whom it is not permitted by virtue of class. That was my question.
Well, I think, it's interesting because for me, I suppose, very working class kind of background really, and I'm kind of, I suppose I'm kind of interested in, I suppose I'm interested in those of ideas of permittance, I suppose, of kind of what's acceptable what I'm allowed to do. So the partly kind of this idea of not what, as a kid, not wanting to get dirty, just it caused revulsion in others. It was like all the lads who were, I suppose, in my circle. It was like, what's your problem? And it's like, and I didn't know what my problem was, because so there's this sense of a kind of, I suppose, trying to make, like, I suppose in relation to this particular piece, I was thinking about trying to make something that was kind of, that played around with artifice and kind of exaggerated artifice, but also, I suppose, the sense of me and my labour and me as a man making this object, and kind of, I suppose, trying to kind of maybe question assumptions around my masculinity or my sexual. A lot of the work was kind of about trying, or a lot of the early work was as kind of, there's a set of ideas around, I suppose, my sexuality or where this kind of hovering. So there's always this sense of in-betweenness, I think. But I don't know whether that answers your question, sorry.
In a roundabout way. Has anyone else got a question before we break for lunch while we still have an appetite?
Thanks for that. Really interesting to see your work and sort of hear those stories around it. I was just wondering about the kind of context that you present the work in. So that all of the images you showed us were galleries, is that right? Or kind of presented in art spaces.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you'd ever located work in other sorts of spaces and if that changed the reading, or kind of, back out in the world.
I suppose the Hal Palamo, it was interesting because that was, I've shown the work. Yes, in this instance, probably a lot of the work was within a gallery context, but I've also probably used the domestic context quite a lot. So maybe not necessarily outside, but I have shown the work in contexts that are not galleries. So the idea of the kind of, the idea of citing it in particular kind of more domestic locations, and that does change the way. So the Hal Palamo piece, it was definitely that making that piece, this idea. Part of it was the idea of being in Switzerland, where people there's no sense of confrontation. You don't, like, I remember being doing my washing in what I thought was my day, because we lived in a block of flats when I did a fellowship over there, and I got a letter the next day from the woman next door saying I hadn't done my washing on the right day. And I was just like, what the fuck? I was so mad, and I was like, why can't they just come and talk to me about it? And there's something about this idea of kind of cleanness and blankness and emptiness, and you don't do everything is kind of done kind of behind closed doors. So lots of the work, I think, was driven from being there, and almost this sense of kind of, like for him it was this kind of, I suppose I gave him that option. It's like this kind of confidence, he's moaning about something, so it's like, go on then, would you? And as a kind of provocation, I suppose, as a sense of showing me some, because there's something about a kind of almost a kind of emotionlessness there that I found, like, you never see anybody getting mad. You don't ever see they don't get upset, and I couldn't quite figure that out. So I think a lot of the work, even though in this instance I've not shown it, has been made for a particular context, and it does change how the work. I think it does change how the work is kind of read or interpreted. Absolutely.